So welcome to our virtual panel sessions. Thank you to SIA for hosting what is a very cool virtual experience. I'm sure I speak for us all, we'd love to be in the room with you, but the world has changed, and so here we are in a virtual sense. And that ties into the topic of today around our new world and doing different. But before we start, my name is Jackie Wyatt. I'm from Cali OCG. And the session we're hosting for you today is about building a bolder MSP. I'll go into the topic in a moment, just in terms of introducing our panelists. We're delighted to have three excellent speakers with us today. We have Sarah Alice, who is the co-author from The Squiggly Career. We have Isabel Hung, director from XB Consult, and also Julie Smith, who was formerly head of global category HR at BAT. So Sarah, Issy, Julie, thank you for joining us and for again embarking on this virtual experience.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So the topic again is building a bolder MSP, and I think what's really interesting is we chose this topic before the world changed. And I think what's really become transparent, both not just before COVID-19, and I'll promise I won't use that word ever again in this session, but I think what's also, what's changed pre and post is that the world of work is changing, and the only consistency is the need for us to do things differently. It was interesting, I was just reading an article this morning from Forbes talking about the 5 positive predictions from the world of work post-COVID. And among leadership and business culture, one of the core things that was referenced was the fact that our new world of work will allow for more diversity. And I guess that means that, looking at the traditional approach from work may not have been as welcoming to those with different capabilities historically, be that physical, be that mental or social. But allowing people to work from home has made way in this new normal that we find ourselves in for different people to contribute to the world of work and to our integrated talent community. And so as a result of this, we at Cali OCG expect to see a very expanded view of how people can bring their best to work, and that's through inclusive design, through new policies and practices, and new approaches that support different ways of building a talent community. And I guess on that note, enhancing that talent community is something that we think we do differently within the Cali group. We were ranked the top 3 by WeConnect International in their list of top 10 global champions for supplier diversity inclusion. And we're the only workforce solutions provider to make this list among some of the other top world corporations, including Merck and IBM, J&J, Marriott, Accenture, Cummins, to name a few. So we're very proud of our approach to diversity, and to, we're quite applauded for that, to the fact that we do help organizations to enrich their talent supply chain. And we recognize that, in the spirit of this topic, building a bolder MSP, building a different and doing different, the talent supply chain is key to building a solid program. So today, with our great panelists, we're going to explore the importance of an integrated talent community and how do you do different? How do you build a bold program? So I guess just to open up to the panel, the first topic we're going to explore is really that concept of doing different. So again, the one consistency we see is that the world of work is changing and we need to be different. So I'd like to open up to Sarah initially in terms of what does doing different mean to you, and what advice do you have for our viewers in terms of people who want to look to do different?
Well, I think it's really interesting when we start to think about doing differently. It almost doesn't matter which aspect of work you look at. Everything had already been changing simultaneously, and that has probably only speeded up. And I think if we look at a couple of particular examples that feel really relevant to our conversation today. So the first, I think, is I don't think any of us expect to have a job for life anymore, or work in the same organisation for the majority of our career. And actually we're seeing a real move to people having maybe 3 or 4 different types of career during their working life, and certainly working for longer. What's really interesting now is we're also seeing much more kind of multiple careers, or what would have been traditionally called portfolio careers, at the same time much earlier in people's kind of working life. Now, sometimes that's through necessity, but often, and particularly within kind of the professional environment, that's through actually people wanting to explore, think about different possibilities, try out kind of different ways of working. So this idea of kind of staying still, kind of staying in one world, I think is really kind of shifting. And it's often helpful, I think, when we're talking about how the world of work is changing, to be really clear about where we're coming from and where we're going to, because sometimes, you know, this area can feel really complicated and it's very kind of dynamic. But I think this idea of one career to many, and sometimes many at the same time, is definitely one that's worth thinking about. I think your other point around diversity is a really good one. So certainly when I started in my career working in mainly very large organisations, there was a real sense of, we want to attract all the smartest and the best people to come and work here, to come and work in our organisation, to work for us. And now I think there is a real recognition that no one has a monopoly on wisdom. That's kind of really one of my kind of favourite phrases that a few leaders that I've spoken to, who I think are progressing in the right direction, have really acknowledged. And that actually it's about, can you create a valuable ecosystem of people who want to work with you, which doesn't necessarily always mean kind of permanently employed. And actually thinking about that is quite a big mindset shift, and that's not to kind of be underestimated. But actually when you start to see it as bringing together the right people at the right time to deliver the value that you need as an organisation, versus you know, the very traditional schematic hierarchical boxes where you'd be, you know, and I've led teams where you think, right, the job to do is to fill all of the boxes and then I'll be done. And actually the reality is that's kind of never quite the case anymore. So I think this kind of shift in, you know, it will feel more transitional in some way, but transitional I think sometimes implies transactional. And I think they're two very, very different things. So again, in terms of where we're going from and to, we're going from a kind of state of wanting everyone to be inside and kind of permanently there and there for maybe as long as possible, to actually getting much more comfortable with this more kind of fluid and more frequently changing dynamic work environment. And again, that's another really big shift I think that we're seeing. But the advantage is, I think the collection of people and skills and experience that you can then bring to bear could be so valuable and meaningful, I think, if organisations start to get this right.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very interesting point. I think you raised some really valid points around there in terms of that new mindset. Julie, what about from your perspective? What do you think leaders can do in terms of, you know, doing different when it comes to looking at an MSP operating model?
I think one of the key things that we can see right now with the talent ecosystem, to pick up on what Sarah was saying, is, you know, the great examples coming out of the current situation where certain sectors and certain industries are in such desperate need for talent that they forget that they're competitors and that there's competition, and are more focused on the actual need to fill positions. You know, what stops us doing that on an everyday basis? Why can't we borrow resources and share and be more collaborative? You know, there's a whole range of reasons why it doesn't happen. But one of the key things that I've seen through Sue Brooks and her Imagine Collaborative, where she's working with a wide range of organisations such as GSK, ARM, Philips, Aviva, to name just a few, and there's plenty more, where they're really looking at different operating models that you can have for sourcing talent, strategic workforce planning, rapid reskilling, and within that, the whole premise of it is around collaborating and breaking down the traditional borders. So, you know, I'm happy to be involved in that, because my perspective as a global procurement person is, well, how would you make that work in the real world in terms of commercially, legally, financially, etc. And this is the thing that it would be great for organizations to do when they're talking about talent, is to bring in all the functions, because they all have skin in the game. And it's around having collaborative discussions internally and externally that enable more than just having a headcount number discussion, which is usually what's happening. So it's get people involved and start thinking, how can we collaborate rather than compete?
Yeah, and I think that's a really big step change, isn't it, in terms of that collaboration mindset as opposed to coming to the table with the singular one company view. And I think that's a really good point. And I think it also ties into breaking down barriers to change or learn behaviors. So on that note, Izzy, be good to have your view. What do you think companies or leaders can do different when it comes to then changing that mindset and breaking down those barriers to change?
I think it's a really interesting question, and having been privileged enough to work with companies going through quite considerable change, we all have experienced that in some shape or form or another, and I don't think there's much difference here. It's just that I think you see companies starting off really well, and both Sarah and Julie have used the word collaboration, and it starts with giving the transparency, sharing we're on the journey, we're about to change, but then something stops and that communication stops and the transparency just goes, and everyone's wondering where they are on that curve. I think that companies going through this at the moment have had to be really transparent with their employees, and I think that is part of the change in terms of leaders have had to be that transparent. And I think of a number of organizations that have come to me and said, how do you think we should communicate this? I sat on a number of calls around kind of internships and how should we do that? And for them it was all about transparency to them, pick up the phone to everybody. And I think when you look at internal communications, it's the one area that we seem to have forgotten about. I think, when I first came into the workplace sort of 15 years ago, head of internal comms was key in every organization. I kind of think that almost has to come back again, because the employee has to come first and the transparency comes first. And I think we're often afraid of giving the bad news and just giving the good news. I think that, in any message, we've hearing bad news every day now. I think people will welcome if companies can continue to be transparent and be very clear about, look, we're making some of these decisions, and I think I was on a call last week, and there was a great company, and they asked all their employees to go down to 4 days and take 20% of their pay, right, to ensure that the whole company was there. They did that with every single individual, even in the countries that it was it's illegal to do that with. They went to the employees and asked directly. And one of the things that came out of that was everybody's opinion now counts, because we're in a world that is unprecedented. So the leaders don't know either. So I'm hoping that coming out of this, leaders will actually be asking for more opinions and options, and everybody's idea or question is relevant, because we're in this new world. I'm hoping that leaders cease that change rather than going slowly. We have an opportunity now to leapfrog all the slow, painful change into something quite significant.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good point. I think, around the themes of, the collaboration now is more important than ever, that having a voice, being heard, and also that communications piece. That's a good point too, around the fact that needs to be prominent, and having a comms lead or a comms approach where every voice is heard. So thank you, really good perspective. I think kind of building on to that, then, if we take that element of change, of communication, of collaboration into building a bolder MSP, be good to address, what areas of conventional thinking do we think we need to challenge in building a better program or a better approach to integrated talent supply chain management. Sarah, perhaps one for you.
Yeah, so I think I saw a really interesting article in The Economist a couple of days ago that's worth reading, that talks about potentially some of the implications and consequences for where kind of the workforce might go in the next kind of year or so. And one of the dangers, and the thing that I really hope we can avoid by thinking ahead now as to kind of what this might look like, is that you do end up with even more of a divide between the people kind of in the organisation and those who are out. So almost kind of the haves and the kind of have-nots. And I was starting to see, and I hope this now accelerates, and certainly I think progressive companies will think about this, that actually if somebody is in your company in whatever capacity right here, right now, they are providing value, you are hoping for them to deliver an output, or what the outcome is that you're hoping for. Actually, how are you going to behave as an organisation? Are you going to behave in a way where half people potentially are treated in one way and half are treated in another? Or is there a way, if you want people to collaborate and create cohesion and to work quickly and to have things like psychological safety, and if you're going to need to do that really quickly because people are working in project teams and are working at pace and you want people to solve problems, you're going to need those teams to come together to kind of gel. And that's the way that those people need to build relationships. But if there's a kind of natural divide, I think that could really get in the way of delivering the value that organisations are going to achieve from potentially sourcing people from different places. So I think even like starting now, if you've not already as an organisation, thinking about that. And again, I think sometimes organisations get stuck in trying to make everything the same for everyone, or in a big kind of theoretical discussion in terms of the academics and how hard it can be to make these things happen. I think you can, to kind of one of the points earlier, be really transparent about you don't have to fix everything simultaneously. I think you could choose a few things that you want everyone to experience, everyone to kind of have available to them, and be really clear about that and say, we think these are kind of two things that are really important. Ask people who are coming in and back out of your organisation and who are there permanently, what is it that people really value, and what can the organisation do? So don't kind of assume the answers. So I think listening becomes really important, and it is okay sometimes to do some of things differently. One of the things I've read recently, and a lady I've interviewed recently is Margaret Heffernan. Margaret Heffernan wrote a book called Uncharted: How to Map the Future. And one of the things that she talks a lot about is not kind of getting stuck in procrastination, but start with experimentation and really prototyping the kind of future you want to create. And you don't have to do that perfectly. The important thing is actually to start to build it, to try stuff out. And I do see sometimes organisations getting paralysed from making progress because actually they're, with really good intention, trying to make everything perfect. And I really recognise that, and I think it often comes from a really good place of you're trying to think about every possible policy or solution and make sure that it's all going to work. But actually some of the best work I think I've done, both when I was leading organisations and now with the organisations we work with, is where you listen to people, create something quickly, be really honest about the fact that you're prototyping, that you want feedback, and then kind of evolve it from there. And actually think now really thinking about that, if you're going to have a real mixture of people from different places, how might that work? What could that look like? What is it you are? What is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the ideal? How do you want people to think, feel? What do you want them to be doing? And then have you got the right things in place to really support that to happen, so that you can get the maximum amount of value from all of that diversity of kind of people from all the different places?
Yeah. A great theme. I think it's focusing on not ensuring you maximize the diversity within your population, but also like your point around not getting analysis paralysis, if you will. That's also really important, isn't it? So great, thank you. And it's just, I guess, taking that a bit more further on the analysis, because you're right. I think we, as an industry, we're going to have to rethink how we do things, how we procure things, how we purchase things, how we measure things, how we measure success, for example. Izzy, I know you and I've had some conversations in the past about this, but what do you think this means if we look again at doing different? What does this mean, do you think, in terms of, for example, how a company would go to market for an RFP for a solution?
I think it's really interesting, and Sarah's comments really resonate me. It reminded me of an audiobook by Ray Dalio, Principles. And it kind of made me think, and probably controversially, is like, do we replace policies with principles? He talks a lot about having guiding principles that the whole company works to, right? They create them almost like having a charter. So rather than having a policy, we all work to a set of principles, and rather than having a process, are there some guidelines instead of it? So you don't have to stringently follow things. And I think that therefore then reflects probably on how you run an RFP. It's at the moment, it's so structured, and we all know sitting down to write an RFP is super painful. Yeah. We've almost proved now that we can turn things around in 2 weeks. Yeah, we suddenly have to work at home. Yeah, businesses have had to do stuff within a space of days, if not hours, going to weeks. Therefore, why will it have to take us 5 weeks to do an RFP, 10 weeks to do an RFP. It's because of all the paperwork and the process and the policy that goes with it. So I could kind of strongly believe if we signed an NDA and we all agreed some guiding principles, why not get suppliers in a room to write that RFP with you? Yeah, and then pick from that someone that you want to move forward with. Why do we have to have 4 or 5 people, to fill out an RFP, which we know we're only going to pick 2? Yeah, invest the time differently for me, and bring the suppliers in. And yes, maybe you don't want to bring them all in together, but actually one by one, have half an hour on the phone, don't write anything, have a discussion about it, and then see where the chemistry is, and then pick 2 and maybe bring them together. Who knows, right? It may be putting an MSP together that has 2 suppliers could be better than just having 1, and they work to a set of principles. For me, I think there's a massive opportunity for us now to be able to move much more with agility, and knowing that the outcome may differ. Because whatever we decide the outcome to be, actually through having more of a brainstorming discussion, for want of a better word, the outcome could be better than what we thought of in the first place. And I think often we get constricted by what we write in the RFP, because through some of those conversations, you suddenly go, oh, I want to change that RFP. I want to do that. I actually want something different, because you've had that collaborative conversation at the beginning. So maybe we throw out the policies and we bring in some principles. Appreciate there's some legalities required there, but surely we can start to be a little bit more agile and a bit more grown up about it.
Yeah, and you raise a great point. The way the world has mobilized to change how we work in 2 weeks has been phenomenal.
Massively.
So I think it's the right time to throw out the rule book and, dare I say, ditch the script in terms of how we do things, and question the status quo, because we've proved as a globe that we can change how we work. So there's no point going on with doing things because that's how we've always done them. So I think it's a really interesting perspective.
Cool.
And Julie, I think, on that note too, we've had some interesting conversations over the months on this too, and this also is dependent on everyone having an open mind and being prepared to challenge the status quo. So from your view, what do you think is critical when it comes to working through challenges and driving innovation in both how you run an MSP program, but also how you approach it?
I think it's very easy to look at things in isolation, and by doing that as a default mechanism, you're only partially dealing with it. So I think picking up on some of the different things that Sarah and Izzy have said, I think one of the key things is, the bigger picture. What are the outcomes and the outputs that you're looking for? And what are the things that you can use, such as the design thinking principles? That's exactly, the kind of direction that would be great for everybody to be genuinely doing, as opposed to talking about doing it. Thinking about the user experience and, collaboration, because these are the kinds of things that, especially if you went through, the principles of the design thinking, what it does is opens up the conversation for innovation, best practice, stop doing things, as Izzy said, why spend all this time doing an RFP, which is probably filled with a range of tick boxes and feels like a tick box exercise, when actually having a more collaborative discussion could be far more fruitful. But to do that, people need to have the open mind to be able to have those kinds of discussions, and to kind of get rid of the existing biases that you may have within your organization, known and unknown biases that stop a range of conversations having. I think the current experience that we're going through is going to teach so many organizations some great lessons. And we've all seen on LinkedIn and social media and the news, all these great examples of things like repurposing, new operating models being developed, new businesses coming to light because of the situation that we're in, where you have to start doing things differently. So instead of thinking of, I can't do something, it's like, well, why not? And I really think, both Sarah and Izzy have talked about this as well, which is just give things a go. Do an experiment, do a pilot, do something, give it a go. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, learn the lesson from it and move on to the next great idea. So having an open mind is going to be really key for organizations to be successful moving forward, whether we're in a crisis or not.
Sorry, just to interrupt, all of us talking has reminded me of, you know, when you drive down the road and there's like roadworks and it's to do the gas pipe, and then 4 months later the water pipe's going to go in, and then they're going to fix the pothole. It reminds me of that. Why can't the gas board, the water board, and the road people all get together at the same time and fix it? It kind of feels like that.
Yes.
We
And
do all these things,
it,
right?
and also fix it overnight, not at 9 a.m., not at 8 a.m. at peak hour.
I just think that things like this have got to shift, because that's taken 12 months when it could all take 4 months and the whole people do it together, because there's too much policy involved.
That exact example, Izzy, is design thinking in practice, collaboration in practice, and user experience as well, because they're thinking about what's the end user here going to benefit from it. And that's the bit that is often missing in these discussions, because it's headcount, it's budget, it's we didn't budget for it, or we can't do it that way because of. There's always a because of, that actually you can work through your because ofs and these barriers by having these open discussions cross-functionally and also with your vendors.
My postman's waving at me. He's got something I need to sign. You carry on. He's waving me through the window, and I'm like,
we are in a virtual world. But I love the analogy of the roadwork, and I think it's awesome. So I think that is the key thing. We've got to change old patterns, old norms, old ways of thinking, and really think differently. And I think, you know, in the past, a lot of our conferences we've talked about solutions. And I think for us, you know, some organizations see solutions or see people as solutions, and for us, that's a real problem. I think, you know, for us, engaging with your talent community is key, and we need to think differently in how we do that. You know, as an example, within CWS, we're currently conducting pulse survey with our suppliers. So going right to the coalface to ensure that we're understanding how COVID-19 is impacting them, what they're doing, how they're changing their operations, and then sharing it with our clients so that they're aware of how that's impacting the supply chain or the future forecasting and the forward planning. And I think Julie's point earlier, that kind of rhythm should be happening, whether it's in a boom or a downfall, which we're in now in terms of I guess the economy. So I think it's really important to make sure that we check in with the supply chain, we engage with them, we think differently, we innovate around how we build talent into those programs. On that note, actually, we're partnering this year with the Business Culture Awards, and they've launched a new award called the Best Integrated Talent Approach for Business Culture. And I think those of you who are listening, if you have some time, check it out. Business Culture Awards, nominate yourselves or others that you think are interested or to be involved. But I think it's a great forum to recognize companies that are thinking differently. And on that note, I think we may still have Izzy's back. You've got your post, so that's fantastic.
I was knocking really loudly. I'm very sorry.
This is the new world of work that we're working in, and I think
it's just some legal documents.
We're all balancing. I think it's like the famous BBC news reader from a few years ago that was doing a very serious broadcast, and not one but two children walked in. So I think it's. That's the new world we're living in, but it makes it interesting. Moving on anyway, in terms of the topic of doing differently, Sarah, what do you think this means in terms of how we need to adapt our ways of working? And by that I mean how we work, where we work, how we're measured. What does that mean, do you think, for us?
Well, I think as an organisation, it's not to be underestimated, I think, the role of leaders as part of this change, because organisations need leaders now to be really clear about what those changes mean to them. Because I think we can talk in big sweeping statements and kind of make generalisations, you know, some of those things I talked about at the start of the conversation, but I think every kind of leadership team now and kind of CEO will be thinking, okay, and what's the so what does this mean for me, for kind of my organisation? And from a kind of leadership perspective, we always encourage people, and back to actually a point that kind of Izzy made, which we didn't know she was necessarily going to talk about, I would always say, think about principles, practicalities and reality, and work through that kind of 3-step process of what are the principles that are the priority for your organisation right now. It could be about how people are working, it could be about what they're working on, and all of those you do have to prioritise, because you can't, I think if you do everything at the same time, you'll go back to that paralysis point. So kind of prioritise which are the principles that really matter most to us right now. Where do we need to accelerate? Where do we want to get the really kind of positive momentum? What will have the most impact for us in terms of our operating model? Then think about practically, what does this mean? And at that point, I think that's when you need to involve, leaders. I think the role of leaders here is to be clear about the priorities in terms of those principles, and then actually move to kind of asking really good questions. I always really like the phrase kind of how might we questions. So how might we, I don't know, create an environment where actually people determine their own working styles? How might we, and as leaders, work out what your how might we questions are, and then involve people to answer them, because it is amazing what people can come up with and the kind of different ideas that people have. And then I think the final thing to do kind of as a leader when you're trying to kind of make this shift and this kind of transition and doing it really quickly is to be very clear about the what, but to give loads of freedom on the how. And that's actually the mistake I think I've seen in some organisations, where they've sort of got that the wrong way around. They're not as clear as they need to be in terms of what the objectives are, being really clear about why we're doing what we're doing, what it is that we're trying to do. And it's about outcomes. It's not about measuring day-to-day outputs and clicks or any of that kind of stuff where you can get into kind of over productivity. And then actually, once you've been very clear about the what, actually give people that freedom to kind of determine and work together in those teams to work out how are they going to deliver that outcome. And I think if you can kind of go through that process and I suppose not see it as a change project. This is not one of those things where you start it, you do some sort of waterfall change project, and then you get to an outcome and an answer. This is, I think, an ongoing commitment from organisations to recognise that they want to move from wherever they are, and everyone is kind of at all different ends of the spectrum. We work with some organisations that have got 18,000 people or 200,000 people, and some that have got 1,000, and everyone's in a different kind of place and have got different priorities. But it's more about figuring out, are you committed to kind of where you want to get to? Have you been really clear about where you're going from, where you're going to, the problems you're trying to solve, and then really getting into those priorities. And yet, principles, practicalities and realities, we have found is a really good way of just figuring out how you can take action, and then and really involving people as well. And I think that's the kind of two things is, leaders have got to lead from the front, and they've got to really believe in it. They've got to be clear on the how might we's. They've got to involve people, and then give people loads and loads of freedom on the how.
Right. And I love that concept of the principalities, also the principles, the practicalities and the realities. So keeping it really grounded and almost back to basics, isn't it? And looking very deeply.
Yeah.
And on that,
sorry, go on. I was going to say, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I recently listened to a podcast with Howard Schultz, who ran Starbucks, and he said we only make decisions based off two things: if it impacts the employee or if it impacts the customer. And I think sometimes decisions are made and they neither impact either of those, right? Because we're thinking about other things. I think another example is, I can't remember the company, I think quite a lot of companies have tried to do this, where they say, here's your budget, we're not going to count your heads, because you could have whatever heads you need. It's about actually how you're going to achieve the outcome. And often, like you said, Julie, we'll get bogged down in this how many FTCs do we have, as opposed to what do we want to achieve? And let's figure out what way to do it. The how is irrelevant, how many people we have, what the process is, what the policy. Maybe it's just about figuring out what we want to do. Like Sarah says, is having that reality and leaving everybody to figure out the middle bit.
Yeah, which creates more empowerment within the population too. And as you say, you're focusing more on the outcome, not the minutiae of the how. You're empowering people to solve for their own how, aren't you, in that model? Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think it just ties on to, I think, another point actually for you, Issy, in terms of our previous conversations, to kind of touching on the topic of collaboration. I know in the past we've talked about collaboration among suppliers and clients, and we've seen this in our own integrated community of suppliers within our programs. But I'm just keen to get your view in terms of what that means, and perhaps an example of that from your
Yeah, and I
former life.
think Julie can probably be testament to this too. I think maybe companies are afraid to bring suppliers or part of the solution into the same room together. And a couple of years back, I brought a CRM provider, a talent solutions provider or research company together, and a social media company and ourselves. And we sat around the table and I said, look, this is kind of what I want to achieve. And we signed an NDA and everybody just talked together as a group. And I think often we talk to individual suppliers as opposed to bringing everybody into the same room, because you know, 4 heads are better than 1. And it actually produced a really good solution for us. We didn't go with it in the end, but more recently, again, I was looking at a research provider, and then I thought about doing some automation with a chatbot and stuff, and I was looking at 2 different proposals, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to put the 2 together and say, why don't you guys talk and tell me what you come up with? And we ended up going with both of them, yeah, as that solution, as opposed to picking one or the other. I just said, well, we just plug them together. And I think we've got to be a bit more comfortable with solutioning. I think the world is no longer about having one thing that fits the whole of your, you know, ATS versus CRM versus wherever. Let's just bring everybody we like together and say, how can you all work the solution out? And we used to do that a lot before technology became big. I remember business objects being middleware, remedy solutions. You know, I remember hiring salespeople, and their job was to be solution salespeople. I think the whole world has forgotten how to do that at all levels.
Yeah, I mean, we've almost become, we've over-engineered everything, I think, haven't we, to the point that it's made it clunky. And the world we're in now is we've had to be agile again. So it's, you know, that's a silver lining of the situation we find ourselves
Hopefully
in now, isn't it? And
100%.
Julie, I know you've got some examples of this too, some view on this this topic and supplier relationships,
I mean,
and what that means.
I think, you know, procurement people, our job is often being solution providers and to build solutions as much as possible. But we never do it in isolation. Our whole premise of our job is collaborating across the organization and outside the organization. And a great enabler for this is SRM, Supplier Relationship Management, because it really enables the partnership and the collaboration. It's, you know, there's a mutual objective of success that all parties have. And an SRM program is great because it helps you develop your purpose, your objectives, your outcomes, and your outputs. And it also does it within a governance framework. That means that the people who have the skin in the game and who are really have a vested interest can sit around a table, theoretically, and be talking both operationally and strategically. And what underpins all of it is continuous improvement, and that's really at the heart of it. You know, and continuous improvement discussions is about finding problems, solutions for problems, finding opportunities, and also for best practice and innovation. So one of the things that I would encourage anyone who's listening to this to do is to work with your procurement team, who are often the creators, builders, and designers of the SRM, and make sure that you've got a supplier relationship management program in place with all of your vendors. And if you do have one, have a fresh eye review of it to make sure that it actually is driving innovation and collaboration. Because again, Izzy, as you said, having these discussions where it's an open discussion, where it's not just an internal discussion, either the talent team or a particular function having a discussion, it's far more better to be always involving your vendor in your discussions around solutions, problems, strategy, principles, etc. It really helps to make sure that everyone's around the table to be involved.
Yeah, and I'd 100% agree with Julie in the sense of procurement's always the first person I go to when I join a new organisation to say, hey, you know, we're going to go and review stuff, come with us, you know, because they're seeing everything across the organisation that we don't see. And I think often they want to, you know, people are afraid of involving procurement because they're worried they're going to lock them down to cost.
Yeah.
And that's very much not that. From my experience of the guys that I've worked with over the last couple of years, it's definitely not. They've contributed greatly to doing that.
Yeah, our role is cost is a small part of it. Actually, our role is around driving solutions, and also value. Are we meeting the value of the business? And are we actually doing something that's going to be better for the organization and better in terms of service, business objectives? Risk is a huge part of what we do. And also, it's about joining the dots. A lot of my job as a procurement person over the last 15 years has been about joining the dots and making sure that all the right people are around the table having the conversation. Going back to your driving down the highway analogy, it's exactly that. It's making sure that we're all together. And a consequence of that is cost, but it's a small part compared to all of the other discussions, which are far more value around driving value.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The cost is the end result and the output, but there's a lot of other ingredients that go into that I think we need to remember, don't we? So I think kind of I'm conscious of time, but moving along, I guess, in terms of, I guess, looking ahead to the future, just as a final few questions. Julie, I guess question for you. What do you think, what kind of actions do you think can be taken by our viewers, our audience here, to help move the MSP further up the talent agenda?
I think one of the key things to have a look at is assess whether you're even on the talent agenda. And if you aren't, then how do you get yourself on there? And if you are on there, how do you get yourself further up there? I think the first thing is around, again, I'm going to go back to having this collaborative discussion, but to understand and be able to define with the stakeholders, what are the problems that you're trying to solve? What are the pain points? Where is there opportunities? Where is there risk? And, you know, how does it fit again into the business strategy and the bigger picture? And then from the defining stage, it's then being able to articulate, well, what can an MSP bring to all of these challenges? And is there any other parties that need to be involved as well? And then, you know, it comes back to partnering and working together. Suppliers should never be in a master-slave relationship. It really should be about partnering and collaborating with each other. And one of the quick sort of things that you could do, and I always recommend people do this, is just a quick hackathon. You know, sit down with the talent team, the MSP, and people from other functions, such as procurement, for example, and have that sort of hackathon around, okay, here is 3 of our biggest challenges that we're facing. Let's work our way through it. And to Sarah's point, let's be practical and pragmatic, and what are the realities and what principles are we going to be working towards? So I think for me, it's, you know, define and be able to articulate value, but also, you know, set some clear practical objectives of what you're trying to do through something like a hackathon.
Yeah, great. And I think we're on that note for an open question for perhaps yourself, Issy, and also Sarah, on that practical point, what kind of steps do you think companies can be doing to expand on the points that Julie's making around how they move the MSP further up the agenda?
I think there's also something to be said. I was thinking about this a lot before the call, and thinking, you know, we are focused on this talent internally, yeah, and we talk a lot about this redeployment recently from other companies to other companies, which has been fantastic. How do we embrace some of that? So do we ask our suppliers now to share some of their own talent agenda, so it becomes something that doesn't just flow through an organization, it flows out? So we're concerned about how our suppliers treat their organizations. So do we you know, will that evolve, because companies are going to be so people orientated anyway? As we start to work with our suppliers, is it something that we can build into, you know, in the agreement? Guys, you know, these are our principles. We need someone that's saying, what do your principles look like? How do you treat your people? What happens if we go through this again? You know, how can we take some of your, I think it's becoming more fluid. So for me, I think it's not just about internally, it's also about externally showing that it's really important to everybody we use. And I think, you know, I kind of go back a couple of years with CWS, isn't it? And they talk about total talent management in a lot of their surveys, from everything from the chatbots, the artificial, all the way through to the individual. Every single person that touches your business is part of the talent chain. So therefore we should be involving each part of that talent change in our principles.
So looking into the future, a question for you, Sarah, you know, what do you find, what kind of actions do you think can be taken to move the MSP further up the talent agenda?
I think I would encourage everybody watching today to think about two things. Their growth mindset. And I think growth mindset is really about your attitude individually and collectively to learning, growing, making the kind of progress to do things differently that we've talked about today. And I think of the two things that are important, I think that's the hardest. That's the one where we've got to get a bit more comfortable, going quicker, feeling uncomfortable, making mistakes, learning from them, being very open to kind of challenge and exploring and just thinking differently. And it's one of those things where having a growth mindset and developing it is very easy to say, and we all hope we have a growth mindset, but the reality of that does take some practice. And, you know, we are often developing new behaviors and kind of new norms in our organizations to kind of really make that a reality. And then I think I'm confident that when I see organizations that have kind of embraced that mindset that I've just described, actually having the skill set is almost the easy bit. So the skill set is, you know, then actually, you know, the practicalities, running in the hackathons, you know, getting the right people in the room, you know, being confident about doing those things, having all the right ideas. I know that with all the organizations that we work with, actually, when they get the growth mindset right, they can make things happen. And so sometimes I think I see people start the wrong way around. They start with this kind of skill set and, oh, you know, task, because we are all quite task orientated, and that's a kind of very natural place to start. But I think just making sure you kind of have the buy-in and you've got the right role models from a leadership perspective, and you're just really clear about what your progress looks like. You've communicated that back to one of the conversations we were having earlier. You've communicated that really consistently and kind of clearly. And then I think that really kind of sets you up for success. So growth mindset and skill set, think about those two things together. But certainly I would encourage everybody to just really start with mindset, and then the skill set is a little bit easier.
Thank you. I think it's a great, some great takeaway points, I think, for our audience today. And so, look, thank you also to our panelists. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Issy. Thank you, Julie. I think if you're tuning in, whether you're a first-generation buyer, looking at how do you start, what does good look like, what does innovation look like, or you're in a second or third generation scenario where you're looking at how do you innovate. I hope today has given you some good food for thought and some good takeaways, be that technical, how do you improve your program takeaways, versus I think, you know, the concept of how do you adopt that change approach, how do you adopt a growth mindset. So lots of food for thought for the audience there. So thank you for dialing in. We look forward to seeing all of you at our next forum, be that a virtual event or an in-person event at the next SIA event. So once again, thank you to our panelists and thank you to SIA. Thank you.